Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The Interconnected World of Pricing, Market Access, and Value-Based Decision-Making, presented by Deloitte. I'm Michael Shashua, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are David Carlson, Market Access and Pricing Offering Leader and Managing Director at Deloitte Consulting LLP. Paul Silver, Risk and Financial Advisory, Life Sciences, Regulatory and Compliance Leader and Principal at Deloitte & Touche LLP, and Clay Willis, Risk and Financial Advisory Senior Manager at Deloitte & Touche LLP. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow our presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A tab on the left side of your screen. Let's begin. Paul, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to what could, for many of us, will be a long holiday weekend. I know well-deserved. We have a really exciting hour planned ahead. And one of the goals we have today is really, to some degree, an interactive session talking about the aspects of the interconnected world of pricing, market access, and value-based decision-making. It comes really in an interesting dynamic in time for the industry. You'll hear more about that today with our dialogue focused on with Dave and Clay. You'll hear as much about technologies, you'll hear about processes and the various aspects that impact all of us as we think about the industry. The goal of this session is interactive, so if there are questions, please feel free to put those into the chat. We'll make sure we address those. We will have about a 15-minute session or so at the end to have Q&A, but again, if there are questions that come up throughout the session, I'll help to moderate those topics and bring those into the discussion as we're able to. So feel free to do that. Let me go over a bit of what we'll be covering today, or the topics we'll cover. And we focused on these topics really as we've been developing this webinar. It's really been based on the demand we've been seeing and hearing from many of our clients. We'll talk a little about what ConvergeHEALTH is. Some of you have heard about it and why that was developed and what it's all about. The current landscape of pricing and market access changing ever so much, even as we think today about the unique dynamics and things going on in our marketplaces. We'll talk about three major points of interconnection product commercialization that we think are really going to be helpful during the session. And then finally, we'll talk about some examples of the importance, as I mentioned at the beginning, of process and systems and how they can work collectively and their interoperability of those two, thinking about process and systems collectively. Don't really think you can have one without the other. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll have some good Q&A and follow-up comments from both David and Clay. So thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to having a great topical discussion, and we'll kick it off. I'll pass it over to my colleague David. We'll do a brief intro of himself, and then we'll jump right in. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks. So for those on the line, thanks for joining us today. My name is David Carlson. I'm a managing director within our life sciences practice at Deloitte. And I'm also what's called a hybrid market offering leader for ConvergeHEALTH within Deloitte. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is. I suspect that most on the line are somewhat familiar with some of the core capabilities of Deloitte. So I will take just a couple minutes to make mention of this thing called ConvergeHEALTH that I've mentioned, just to give folks a little bit of context around that. So, several years ago, a number of executives within Deloitte, saw a need in the industry to kind of, in some respects, do things a lot better than the way things were being done today. And the approach that we took at Deloitte was, what would healthcare look like if we could simply start from scratch? And as we started to tease apart that question, we came upon what we think is the model for a very novel kind of digitally connected healthcare system that would enable more control by patients with respect to some of their underlying health data, as well as patients being more digitally connected to caregivers and folks within the within even their payer and reimbursement channels. And so with that in mind, we set out to build out some platforms, really to build out a new ecosystem to better to better encompass some of those endpoints. And we'll talk about some of those today. So where are we now? So it's a number of years later, and at this point, ConvergeHEALTH systems and solutions have grown quite a bit. So we're no longer just kind of an upstart at this point. We have solutions across over 20 geographies globally. We've got between 1.5 and 2 million patients either actively making use of or somehow supported by some of these digital assets. And we even are in the area of insurance claims. We've got north of 1 billion claims kind of passing through some of these systems. We're highly collaborative, and we make use of a number of technology alliances that you see on the right-hand side there, along with our over 60 subscription clients that we have in place. So we've grown substantially over a short period of time, and we did that really by following a North Star, kind of our promise to those that we engage with, and that is, we think that the clients that we're working with on some of these ambitious goals expect us to have the agility of a healthcare startup, while at the same time being backed by kind of the breadth and depth of Deloitte and Deloitte's ecosystem of partners. We're currently employing the most cutting edge platforms that we can get our hands on. We're continuously exploring new and innovative platforms and technologies that we can bring into the fray. And all of this is to really help our clients realize a vision of creating a much more kind of value-based, personalized style of healthcare that connects a lot of the dots that the ecosystem really needs connected today. And so some of what we're going to talk about today is going to be relating to pricing, market access, and value-based decision making. And so that kind of component of the ecosystem is something we're going to spend some time today on. We'll start out by having a discussion of kind of where we're at, so kind of a discussion of landscape, as Paula had mentioned before. So let's get moving.
And David, as you get started on these, I know a couple of questions have come through on the slides. We'll absolutely make sure, for those that maybe were having difficulty, we'll definitely make sure you get those the slides. And if there are any questions, again, continue to put those into the chat. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly to the extent that people need some of these slides, we are going to be making those available via PDF along with some other links if people have an interest. So please reach out. So let's talk about the landscape for pricing and market access. We're going to focus in on really 4 attributes of pricing and market access. And there are more, but we want to be able to dig into a couple of these concepts. And so the first I want to talk a bit of time around is the notion of innovative organizations. So what we're seeing is manufacturers having a renewed interest on attributes such as automation, but really it goes way beyond automation and into data discovery, the use of AI and machine learning to really kind of disrupt the way that they've been doing business. And there is absolutely, within the clients that I come across, a relentless focus on scale. Essentially, what a lot of our clients are seeing is that they've got meaningful innovation coming down the pike, and a lot of their decision support mechanism, a lot of the data and analytics footholds that exist within their organizations have requirements for manual intervention and kind of brute force that is not ideal and does not allow the organizations to scale. So certainly one of the kind of thematically, one of the portions of the landscape that we're going to talk a bit about is this notion of innovative organizations and employing kind of novel techniques to help our clients scale. The next thing that we're going to talk about, and I think some of the builds, we had this as a build to help digest some of this, but what we're also seeing is increasing focus on innovative contracting. And this kind of came about, I would suggest it was kind of predictable in how it came about, in that, there are a lot of really valuable novel therapies that have come to market in recent years, and some of those novel therapies come with very high price points. And essentially what the other stakeholders in these ecosystems have asked for is some assurances, some material assurances on the performance of these products. And there's been an increasing level of interest in being able to strike reimbursement schemes that, frankly, compensate outcomes as opposed to just compensating for volume or doses or vials or things of that nature. And so we did a survey within Deloitte. This is a little data, it's just prior to COVID, but I think the data still holds. And that is for nearly 80% of those surveyed had indicated that VBCs, the employment of VBCs, is one of their top priorities within their organization, and actually over 40% said it was within the top 5. And so at the same time, we also see that 2 out of 3 organizations that were surveyed have been putting in place incentive structures that align with more of a value-based approach and a value-based business model, and have in fact been adapting roles and responsibilities to align with that. So what types of things do we see within value-based or innovative contracting? As you might expect, it's many of the innovative TAs, disease states, that we see more aggressive moves into the innovative contracting. I mean, there are a number of synonyms: innovative contracting, value-based contracting, outcomes-based contracting. Some of these things mean slightly different things, but are used somewhat independently. The next has to do with regulatory change. And so for this, I'll hand the reins over to Clay to walk through a bit of what we're seeing from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah, thanks, David. And my name's Clay Willis, and I'm a leader within our market access, pricing, and contracting group here at Deloitte, and specifically focus on providing solutions to manufacturers around, each of market access, government pricing, state price transparency. So, as David mentioned, the regulatory landscape is continuing to change. One example, that we wanted to kind of highlight here, because there's many that I could speak to, but one example of how those regulatory requirements are connected with pricing is around state price transparency. So as you can see, kind of on the left-hand side there, state price transparency reporting requirements were really enacted to address a lot of the drug cost and the spending. They've really further complicated the landscape, due to some of the pricing pressures that are out there, and there's significant reporting requirements, for pharmaceutical manufacturers. A lot of this started back in 2016 when the first law was enacted, and since then there have been, I think there's now 17 states that have enacted regulations, and just to give some concept to that, some of these states have multiple types of reporting requirements. So it could be around a launch of a new drug. It could be around, a particular price increase that may around a particular trigger. It could be around, just periodic WAC reporting. So just a couple examples the types of reporting requirements. So as new states continue to pass these regulations, there's more each and every year, but there's also amendments to existing regulations. So again, the trend around this has gained significant momentum recently and is likely to continue in the years ahead as additional states introduce and pass, further regulations around this. So it's very important for manufacturers to understand the requirements and the implications, it could have on your business. In addition to that, as I mentioned, around, why is this important from a regulatory standpoint? There's also compliance risks associated with this. So as you can see there in the middle, over the last couple of years, California has begun enforcing some of its state price transparency laws and have kind of notified manufacturers of fines, totaling approximately $17.5 million, as well as Nevada imposing fines that are totaling, approximately $24 million. So again, some of the early enforcement here, could signal an increase of likelihood that other states may follow. But again, just one example, of some of the regulatory changes and things that are going on. There's also, from a regulatory standpoint, there's things that are happening at the federal level and within government program regulations, which are also constantly changing and evolving, with the current environment. A recent example is CMS's final rule around value-based purchase agreements, multiple best prices, expanded alternative URA, and other Medicaid-related changes. So again, these new rules have significant pricing and market access related considerations, given the impact it could have around commercial strategies as well as government payer program liability. So all of these are just a few examples of why the elevating compliance implications, that are out there around adjustments to price that companies are looking at today.
Great, thanks, Clay. Yeah, and we'll just kind of continue down this this path. We'll talk a bit more about some of these state price transparency regulations, and including kind of why those might have been put in place. So just kind of progressing down our kind of landscape view here. Another item, and this is actually one that we're going to be spending the majority of our time on today, is this notion of interconnected decision making. I've been working, I guess, within this industry since the 90s, and if I think about the three circles that you see here relating to market access, pricing, and value-based insights, I almost think about these rings as kind of coming together slowly over the years, more and more. And if I think back in late 90s or early 2000s, frankly, these silos were just that. I mean, they were silos, and they you had siloed data, you had typically siloed analytics, differing processes and systems, oftentimes P&Ls in very different categories, right? Personnel. When it comes to value-based insights, quite frankly, if I think about this over a longer arc of time, over multiple decades, value-based was really, those were insights that were predominantly mined to obviously understand some of the product characteristics, but for life sciences companies, they were looked at in order to have a meaningful dialogue with the payer community. They were looked at to make sure that they could have a meaningful dialogue with physicians when detailing, with patients. So kind of like more of a promotional apparatus. And it took some time before that value-based circle even started to like meaningfully make its way in. But when I think about especially the last 10, maybe 15 years, what for me has really become pronounced is that center shaded area where kind of the overlap across some of these different areas within a pharma have been increasingly kind of overlaying because some of the business questions require different voices throughout the organization. And so, we'll talk a little bit about how that manifests itself. I mean, if I kind of think about some of the why, it would be, obviously there's what we talked about before around the need to kind of prove value more. And then there's also the need to, I guess certain political pressures that are in play as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that over time as well. But let's move to the next. Yeah.
David, a question came in a little bit about, as we think about both, Clay talked about the compliance and regulatory environment, you think about the commercial environment. Do you see the convergence of both of these while you have these state price transparency regs now elevating and then the dynamics in pricing and market access evolving? I don't think it's by chance. What do you guys think collectively of these colliding together, and you think about the strategy and the compliance requirements?
Collective thoughts. I mean, I'm happy to lead off on that. I mean, maybe let's get at why state price transparency regulations are even being put in place, right? I mean, the goal behind those is to have an impact on price adjustments, right? Mm-hmm. That's why they shine the light on this. And so they're not necessarily restricting how pricing is adjusted, but they're very much making it known as to who and which brands are seeing higher rates of change with respect to price and other attributes. And I'll kind of hand this to Clay before I kind of finish my thought on that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Again, just giving further transparency with everything that's going on today into what those prices are, right? And really the ability to kind of see and full exposure as to what those are through those different types of requirements.
Yeah, what I'd also say, I've advised on well over a dozen launches, and what I have noted, and my typical areas around pricing and reimbursement, right, and the use of data and analytics to do that in kind of a thoughtful manner. Well, what I've noticed kind of with products that are launching right now, as opposed to say products that were launching 15 years ago plus, is there's recognition that there's going to be less of an ability to increase pricing over time, but there's still, from an investment standpoint, there's still kind of that core need to realize a certain return on that investment. And so, kind of perversely what's happening is we're now seeing teams needing to launch brands at higher prices so that they can then have a lower kind of growth runway over time. And so I think, oftentimes the kind of the best plans can go differently than what you hope, right? And in this case, I think the unintended consequence of trying to constrain pricing is that pricing of the most novel therapies is actually is now front loaded as opposed to kind of back loaded. But
great.
All right. Well, thanks for your question, Paul. So, I'll go to the next component here, which is really all of these together. There are other attributes that are informing our view on landscape. Certainly things like virtual care, ubiquity of data, and things of that nature, and some of the data science that we can apply to it. But we're going to continue to lean in on some of these aspects today in today's conversation. And in particular, we're gonna dig in on that third around interconnected decisions. let's do that now. So, we looked at those three circles before of market access insights, pricing insights, and value-based insights. And, we wanted to dig in a little bit on each of those areas and then dig into that overlap that we talked about. Now, I'll candidly, we as a team had to kind of resist the urge to double click too far on these topics, given the constraints of time. So we only had, less than an hour to talk about some of these concepts. And so for us, we wanted to make sure that we could talk about that high level, and then to the extent that people on the line are interested in having a follow-up conversation, or to dig into one or two of the specific topics that we talk about, please don't hesitate to do that. So with market access, we'll start with number one, and I've got, we'll kind of dig into that a bit more deeply. That's where, in terms of gleaning insights that are useful from a market access perspective, we obviously need to predict the impact and the cost of different access levers. So let's kind of unpack that number one a bit. I mean, ultimately, what is market access? I mean, market access has been called many things over the years: managed markets, you'll have payer analytics, or contract analytics. But ultimately, the goal of market access is, as the name implies, it's to ensure that your product is accessible as a manufacturer. And there are a few steps within any analytical process to be able to do that with confidence. First and foremost, obviously, is to better understand and to quantify to what extent are some of the access barriers that are in place actually able to have an effect, right? So examples of access barriers might be higher copay levels, or a rejection for the need for a prior authorization, or the need to go through some kind of step therapy. So those are all different barriers that are in place between a patient and a specific product. And so the first thing we would need to quantify is to what extent are we, if we were to remove those barriers, to what extent would that matter? And then kind of the second step would be, when working with specific entities, so specific, say, payers or PBMs, to what extent would it cost the manufacturer to remove that barrier from between the patient and the product? And then you get to a very basic question of, is it worth it? Like, analytically, is it worth it? And at that point, you're able to have, a high degree of, I think, predictive power around making sure that, incentives across a number of the healthcare ecosystems or a number of the healthcare stakeholders are aligned. Now, step two there is then measuring that. So measuring the whether or not your prediction is aligning with outcomes, or for the finance people in the room, with actuals, right? So as we start to make predictions around these agreements, or these access barriers being removed, as we have predictions in place, we then want to measure and understand to what extent the actions that we're taking are actually having an effect. And we do that through what we have here as number three, which is really then digging into the why. So once we have a prediction in place, and then once after the fact, as we've looked at the extent to which that prediction aligns with what absolutely actually happens, we then need to be able to kind of understand to what extent we can kind of dig into the performance and understand how do we influence that differently, right? So we'll kind of move to the next area here, because I am getting a time check. And that's around pricing insights. So, you talk to people in kind of pricing groups and what it means to do pricing. can differ dramatically. Are we talking about government pricing, which to me is kind of like a dark art? Is it top line kind of list pricing? What we're talking about with pricing insights here is, to the extent that we are thinking about adjusting the list price or the WAC price of our brand, what impact is that going to have? And we start out by trying to understand the impact on price, on product utilization, but then we also need to understand, and by the way, when we think about product utilization, price relative to utilization, that's where traditionally you would do what like these S curves around to what extent does an increase in price ultimately bend the curve of use. So there's certainly meaningful analysis that can be done around understanding how price affects use. But then the other piece is, to what extent does a price adjustment impact the bottom line? And with that actually becomes an area of overlap that we're going to spend some time on in a little bit, which is, that's not as straightforward as you might think, because over the past 10, 15 years, it's become much more common for commercial and Medicare Part D contracts to include what's called price protection, sometimes called price predictability clauses. And essentially what that part of the agreement states is, it's an agreed upon limitation in terms of the extent to which the manufacturer is able to increase the price of a product. And that numeric can fall, frankly, anywhere. Typically, you would see, somewhere between 0 and 15%, let's say, and I'm giving myself a very wide berth here. But then also, as you move from payer and PBM to other payers and PBMs, it comes with different structures in place. It comes with different levels and different criteria, and so it actually can be a fairly thorny metric when you start looking at adjusting a price across a whole host of contracted agreements. So I'll kind of pause there and then move to number 3. And maybe Clay, would you mind chatting a bit about some of our compliance?
Yeah, and I'll just add, just to piggyback some of the additional things on the bottom line, as well as, thinking about, a lot of the government programs, and specifically, I get asked a lot of questions, unfortunately, kind of after the fact, but there's a lot, the impact of a price adjustment and what that may do to, your AMP value, that then has a downstream impact on potentially CPIU and your URA value, which is ultimately the unit rebate amount that you're paying, for all your Medicaid utilization. But on the flip side, it also drives down your 340B price. So just understanding how all those are connected, and really the fact that in a lot of times you're trying to be complying with the regulations, but just understanding up front, what those price changes, could do in some of those government programs. And those are just a couple examples. From a compliance perspective, as I mentioned earlier, there's obviously a lot of changing regulations that are kind of continuing to shift, and compliance really remains at the forefront. I think sustaining compliance really kind of requires that appropriate level of due diligence, that you take the program seriously, and making sure you have a plan in place for ongoing compliance around trying to meet the particular reporting requirement and in a timely fashion, whether that's state price transparency, government price reporting, whatever it may be, as it relates to some form of price related reporting. It also, and it does create operational challenges. There are varying legal interpretations of some of these requirements, where you really have to make reasonable assumptions to around some of these when things are not black or white. I mentioned some of the penalties for non-compliance that may lead to fines and things like that. There's also an operational challenge around ability to scale existing process. So continuing to think through, future regulatory changes, future state price transparency regulations, and, the ability to not only maintain what you have been doing today, but also being able to manage that with the guidance changing in the future, but also as your business changes. And then finally, another, operational challenge around, maintaining compliance is really having, limited staff and resources to kind of, keep up with everything that's going on. So, as new pricing strategies are changing, the ever-changing regulatory, environment's changing, continue to think through, I think companies are now realizing, that need to kind of collaborate and coordinate across the various groups of commercial, market access, compliance, and regulatory to kind of maintain, again, the overall compliance for the organization.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Clay. So, it just strikes me, to what extent, you mentioned earlier on the prior slide that these regulations are changing really quickly, and even just like the interpretations of existing law or regulation has been changing quickly. How does one typically keep up? And more importantly, do we expect that to kind of trail off, or do we think that there's going to be some kind of acceleration there?
Yeah, I think typically what I see is a cross-functional collaborative effort, right? So you may have people within your organization, whether it's government affairs or folks in legal or others, right? Kind of out there keeping the pulse around what's from a regulatory perspective may be changing. But then, as I mentioned, it's cross-functional, right? So you've got to kind of operationalize those requirements and knowing, what to do with those to kind of assess if you've maybe met one of those requirements or what you need to do to put in place to monitor that and do the reporting. So again, it's very cross-functional in nature, and there's a lot of people involved with kind of assessing what's out there, operationalizing, and then even on the other side, kind of forward-looking pricing, what to do with pricing strategies as you think about these as well. They're all interconnected.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just real quick, and I'll let you guys keep going. As we get closer to the Q&A session, there's going to be, I know questions come across around, and just think about this around M&A, and you think about the product commercialization aspects as well as compliance. And you think about a company buying another company, and how does all that play in when you've got similar scenarios or very different? We'll put that as a parking lot, but we'll come back to it. Hopefully there'll be some other questions coming in with some interesting topics.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Paul. And I also think about this this specific item relative to that landscape item around clients wanting to relentlessly scale, right? So it's really hard to relentlessly scale if you don't have kind of a static set of, if you will, rules to go by. And so certainly figuring out a different way seems quite important in that sense. So I'll keep pushing on, and I know that we ultimately want to leave some meaningful time to be able to address some of the Q&A that we've been getting. So. All right, so within the next item, this is where we touch on value-based insights. This is, again, where, for a number of different reasons, stakeholders within the ecosystem have been, kind of looking to the extent possible, I almost want to say, paying for results as opposed to use, And if you think about that in analytical terms, which certainly that's what I think about in terms of how do I predict an outcome of a value-based agreement, for example? How do I then measure that agreement over time, monitor that over time? So bullet point number one, it's pretty tricky because a lot of the value-based agreements that have been struck wind up kind of requiring the kind of alignment of oftentimes clinical data elements with commercial or financial data elements, and sometimes those attributes have not, for that organization, been pulled together and kind of associated together in the past. So it does create, some interesting, I think, data management and data discovery type challenges. Then you move, but clearly there has to be kind of that ability to measure and monitor. But then the other one is alignment, and alignment is not just around kind of aligning with one's kind of controller, CFO, if you will, on how much should I accrue for a value-based agreement, though that is certainly one element of alignment that's important. Alignment is also in the form of your counterparty for, say, an agreement that you might want to strike. And so, some of the deals that have been in play and kind of often fell apart because of, simply different data definitions that, people thought that they were on the same page when they struck an agreement, but then things kind of fell down a little bit because on execution, there were different interpretive aspects that had a material impact on the deal. So that element of alignment is enormously important, and certainly you can use third parties to help bridge some of that. And then the last one is understand performance in commercial terms. We built some of these items within ConvergeHEALTH, as you might expect. And one of the things that we're in the midst of working on now is actually bringing some of these different deals together such that an organization is then able to evaluate the success or failure of agreements, whether they are kind of traditional, if you will, volume-based agreements, or more innovative contracts that perhaps make use of clinical terms, conditions, but to view all of those on a kind of a single view. And what that allows for is the client to then, kind of look at these deals relative to one another, even though they can have radically different types and radically different kind of adjudication mechanisms, but they can then kind of look at those deals in an apples to apples way, which can clarify the extent to which those deals are ultimately, worth it. And so with that, and with an eye on time, I will continue to march forward. But what we have here now is we've done a couple examples of where some of this intersection is just so enormously valuable. There are a lot of examples of where we can where we see intersection. So we chose a couple. In the event that individuals on the line want to have a follow-up conversation relating to any of these intersections, please let us know, because we can obviously kind of craft that for that discussion. But we thought it might be most intuitive to talk about the intersection, much of the intersection between market access insights and the pricing insights. So, for example, we'll have two examples, and they're kind of they go back and forth, but they use some of the same metrics, which made it easier. One is if we think about making a price adjustment. Here again, we're talking about to what extent should we adjust the WAC price or the list price of our brand, and to what extent would that adjustment fall to the bottom line? That's a question we want to kind of unpack on the next slide. And then after that, we'd like to kind of almost turn the same scenario on its head, but look at that from the perspective of a commercial contract as well. So with that, if we kind of break apart this example a bit, as I say, what we've got is a company that's really wanting to better understand the impact of a WAC price change. So in other words, and I'll just, we didn't use numerics in here per se, but in other words, a team is sitting there thinking about, should we be increasing the price of this brand by 2%, 4%, 6%, 8%, whatever it might be? How do we understand the degree to which that's going to fall to the bottom line? Now, the first question we have to unpack is how's that going to impact kind of the core utilization of the product? So in other words, how is that going to bend the utilization curve? From a top line perspective, if we for a moment, even if we assume that there is going to be some use that falls off, you did increase the price, so you would expect a top line impact, but we need to kind of make some adjustments around that. But it's not an accident that you kind of have patient impact and top line impact kind of on the same level there. And then, kind of last element under the orange with pricing is around compliance impact. And that's a lot of what Clay has been talking about in terms of what kinds of, compliance or administrative or just transparency attributes are going to present themselves in the event that you go forward with one of those different price adjustments. Then on the market access side, so now we're kind of in that other circle for a moment. To what extent are those discounts going to change? So recall that when we talked about price protection, what that is, it's essentially setting a max increase on price for a product within an individual account. And so that might be, say, 4%. Well, that means everything above, and I'm grossly simplifying, but everything above 4% is going to go back to that entity in the form of a discount, right? So in other words, with that entity, you get zero value for increasing the price as a life sciences company. Each entity that you contract with may have different styles, different levels, different ways of measuring that increase. And so what that does is it creates kind of an analytical challenge of going through each and every commercial and Medicare Part D contract with very bespoke terms and conditions in order to really suss out exactly how much of those different price increases are going to, ultimately fall to the bottom line to create some clarity there. And then just for completeness, I include the impact of access. We don't really talk about that here, but presumably we're executing an agreement to reduce a barrier, to keep a barrier the same, but we don't really know, so I'm going to pass on that. So that's one example of overlap. Another example goes the other way, and that is we're looking at a commercial contract. We're negotiating a commercial contract. To what extent will different price increases, to the extent that we can start to model some of those differences out, to what extent will different price increases affect the profitability of that commercial contract? So when we look at that from a pricing perspective, we still have effect of patient utilization, right? So that's still there. But then we can have dramatically different effects on the gross sales for that contract, and ultimately actually the net sales for the contract, based on the extent to which that increasing level of price is going to get maybe swallowed up in different discount terms and conditions. So
Dave,
these are a couple of examples. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to interrupt you real quick. I know we're getting the last 10 minutes. A question that's come across, and we'll just flow into it as we think about Q&A, but you think about some of the pricing changes. How much do we take into account the unique dynamic of the disease state of where you might see pricing changes based on whether it's a lifestyle drug versus cancer product, and where that might be, where the impact is of patient demand versus price increase?
Oh yeah, I mean that's core, right? I mean that's almost the starting point, because I mean you on one level a lot of the discounting that occurs, which is kind of what we're talking about here. You think of payers, and oftentimes payers, PBMs, are looking at the net cost for some of these therapies, or the net cost to be able to treat one of their, in this case, I'll use the term members, for that disease state. And so as you elevate price, obviously that net cost goes up, but they're also, if it's a competitive market, they're looking at the net cost of every single competitive brand. And so those competitive dynamics do certainly have a role to play, not just in the extent to which you can increase the price of the product, but also the extent to which you need to be enacting aggressive discount terms and conditions in order to incentivize payers to continue to give your product, to make your product accessible to their patient community. Does that make sense?
Yes, great question too. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just kind of sprint forward so that we can get into more of the questions. This is kind of all of what we just went through on a single slide. So in other words, we obviously have this evolving pharma landscape. All of these questions that we've gone through, and to various extents, they require certain levels of system interoperability. They require, oftentimes a shared data footprint. And the reason why that's important is because you often will want to have certain dimensions of data that are, coming off of the same dimensional hierarchy, or you might want to be using the same customer hierarchy within the data. But we need to allow for data discovery across a number of data elements that oftentimes are not used to being associated with one another. And there's definitely science behind getting that done, and getting that done in a way that can be automated. Because here again, if we think about that need to be able to bring innovative analytics, innovative decision support to manufacturers that are wanting to aggressively scale, then we need to be careful and mindful with how we do that. I'll just say one last thing on this last slide, and then we can move to questions. What I will say is that within ConvergeHEALTH, we've created what's called the Minor Access Suite, specifically to tackle a lot of these challenges in concert. We platform a number of different data elements together, and we've built solutions that have interoperability because they're sitting in the exact same place. It's delivered in a modular format so that clients are only needing to license what they want and not everything. And that takes us all the way from kind of being able to predict the outcomes on a managed care deal, and then measure how those outcomes did relative to expectations, to pursuing value-based strategies so that you can understand the impact across value-based and traditional volume-based agreements over time. And it's all sitting on the same pricing footprint. Again, we're making use of the same data, but for different use cases. And one of those use cases are what we captured within pricing analytics earlier that we think are key and core. And that's inclusive of embedded state price transparency compliance. And so within that, we also are able to flag on an ongoing basis to what extent certain compliance regulations or compliance requirements are going to be triggered. And we're able to keep that whole system and framework kind of up to date, thanks to a number of our practitioners within the Deloitte team, Clay being the leader of that team. So with that, what I'll do is I'll just go to the last slide, which has our contact information. I'll hand it over to you, Paul, for some of the remaining Q&A. But you'll note that we do have our contact information on this slide. Feel free to reach out if anything that we talked about would be of interest. So Paul, take it away.
Great. Thank you, David and Clay. And, as you hear the topics that you guys hit on, it is very interesting in the way you think about the aspects of compliance, regulatory, and the operational realities and how they do. As we talk about our own tool called Converge, it's no secret that aspect of convergence happens here as well. I want to go back to the question that I mentioned earlier on M&A, and you talked about these dynamics and landscape. Maybe just hit on briefly. I think it's a very active market now as we see things going on. And the question asked around how do we think about this whole dynamic here when you either, in particular, on a buy-side transaction, right? And thinking about that landscape. And Clay, I think it'll also both be operational, and then from a compliance perspective, you think about even drug price transparency. Now you're having to make sure you think about the acquirer and what their processes were versus the ones you have. Dave, let me start with you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I've worked on product acquisitions for manufacturing clients. Worked on deals in the past, and there certainly some of this comes into play where, during the course of the deal, some of what is being quantified is kind of what's the cost to run this thing that I'm acquiring, and to the extent that some of that becomes more achievable, then that has a positive impact. The other thing I'd mention is, uncertainty just kills multiples. When you're selling an asset, or if you're buying an asset, you strive for as much clarity as possible so that you don't overpay for that asset. And so to the extent that you're employing analytics, and especially analytics, I think, that have prospective, kind of predictive power in the future, and if you're supported by, not just an organization. So if you've kind of built out a strong organization that is clearly good at helping you manage compliance risks and helping you kind of identify other challenges to the P&L proactively, I think that has kind of, on the buy side, that would have upward impact. Anything to the contrary would, I'd be short that concept. But Clay, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add, like, more on the compliance and some of on the buy side again. One, being aware of some of the price changes that have occurred and what's already been triggered with some of the reporting requirements, both on the government pricing side, as well as, from a state price transparency perspective, in terms of what states they've already triggered and what their process is, around those. So just understanding that you don't want to get yourself in a situation on the buy side where there could be reporting requirements that, maybe, weren't submitted or whatnot, or as you consider pricing changes, you want to take those into consideration moving forward as well.
That's very helpful. A question, I think, on one of the earlier slides is, I think you guys were talking about both Nevada and California. I know we don't have a crystal ball, but what do we think's happening? Where do we see trend-wise as far as states are coming on? Clay, we know we're addressing many of those things. David, we're seeing it as we continue to elevate some of our processes and technologies. Just as we get to the last couple of minutes, maybe both of you a little prediction of where you see things maybe heading, and a couple of quick thoughts. And maybe for this audience, we've got a lot of people on the line. What do we think makes sense for them to be thinking about as we get into the second half of the year? David, I'll start with you.
I mean, I'll save the some of the regulatory insight for Clay, because that's his wheelhouse, not as much mine. But what I will say is what we're seeing in the marketplace from a pricing, what we call pricing analytics, which is inclusive of helping clients manage that state price transparency component, is we seem to have hit some kind of threshold upon which clients are no longer able to really manage that the way that they had managed it. And so I think right now we seem to have been in the midst of some enormous change happening across states, and kind of within the industry recognition that this is a new compliance need, or relatively new. I mean, I think, Clay, you had said 2016 was the first one. So new compliance need that has to be managed over time, and there's huge risk to not do it well. So I mean, what I will say is that in terms of change, is that I'm seeing clients take this very seriously now, because they do see the risk out there, and I think they see a more aggressive, enforcement protocol coming down the line. So, but
thanks.
And
your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think it's probably related to a lot of the different new states and the regulatory requirements and the operational challenges and risks that are continuing to come on board. I mean, we saw a little bit of a slowdown with, for about a year as states were dealing with a lot of the things around COVID. But since then, over the last couple of months, we've seen an uptick with a few new states coming on board. As well as, states amending historical requirements, whether it's adding penalties or new types of requirements, et cetera. So I think this is going to continue moving forward. And again, a lot of changes, not just on the state price transparency front, but just across the board at the federal level as well, with some of the government programs and things like that around price.
Great. Well, David, Clay, thank you both very much. I was thrilled to be a part of this today. Collectively, we do a lot of thinking, analyzing, and supporting our clients in the space. One of the things I know that came up, there were questions about more insights and understandings about what we talked about, the minor access suite of services. There is a video. We're happy to provide you more insight on that, and we'll make sure you get that information on the minor access suite so you can see that it's actually is done as a YouTube, which is helpful and accessible to you. We'll also provide you a PDF of the slides. Several of you asked about those as well, so we'll make sure you have those. By all means, if you have questions for Clay, David, or myself, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is below, and we look forward to connecting with you soon. Have a safe and healthy holiday, and happy July 4th. Thank you.
Thanks for your time, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you for attending this Fierce Pharma webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Deloitte for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.